Society Matters.
Hello, and thank you for joining me today. I'm your host, Dr. Susanne Seperson, and this is our 10th episode of the podcast, Antisemitism and the United Nations and in Society, on hmTV. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest, Professor Thane Rosenbaum. Thane Rosenbaum is a law professor, legal and Middle East analyst, scholar, novelist, essayist, talk show host, film producer, and distinguished university professor at Touro University. He's the author of numerous books of fiction and nonfiction, including Beyond Proportionality, Israel's Just War in Gaza, Saving Free Speech from Itself, Payback, The Case for Revenge, and The Myth of Moral Justice, Why Our Legal System Fails to Do What's Right. He has received the Louis Rappaport Award for Excellence in Commentary and the Rockover Award for Excellence in Cultural Criticism, and has written for the New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal, among other publications. He's the legal analyst for CBS News Radio, the founder and creative director of the Forum on Life, Culture and Society, host of The Talk Show at 92nd Street, NY, and appears frequently on cable television news programs. I first became acquainted with Professor Rosenbaum watching him on TV on JBS, if I remember correctly. It is indeed my honor to welcome Professor Rosenbaum. So welcome. Terrific. So let's start with some questions about your background, your career, and we'll go from there. We'll discuss your writings, your discussions, and we'll go on. So first, your background. If you would be kind enough to tell us a little bit about your background, where you grew up, your family, and what in your background do you think influenced your career path? First to become an attorney, then a professor, then a writer of fiction and nonfiction books.
Whoa, I want to do that in a quick way. I want to respond quickly because I'm sure you have far more important questions than that. I don't particularly enjoy speaking about myself, but I can briefly say I was born in New York City in Manhattan, and my parents moved from Manhattan at a time that is not unlike what we're seeing today, with the potential for rising crime and progressive politics, when New York City had become unlivable and the tax base eroded. And I just did an event last night in which I said, I'm a little older than most people in the crowd, but I can tell you that, this mayoral election is familiar to me because when I was a little boy in Manhattan, very similar politics is what drove us out of the city into Miami Beach, Florida, where I grew up as a Floridian. I was a Wall Street lawyer here in New York for a number of years. I was unhappy and thought that I had an artistic sensibility, and I went off and started writing novels. I got lucky and started to publish them, and then I got a job at Fordham Law School as a law professor, and then my editors said, you should probably write nonfiction too. So I started writing nonfiction, which is rare in the United States, where people write novels and the kind of nonfiction that I write. I don't write for academic audiences. All of those nonfiction titles that you listed, especially including the most recent one, Beyond Proportionality, Israel's Just War in Gaza, is written for laymen. It's not for lawyers. It's for people who really don't know what to say when someone uses the words genocide, and they assume if you scream genocide long enough or loud enough, it must be true. And so if you read Beyond Proportionality, you know how ludicrous that charge is. And it takes you through international law, military doctrine, even history and cultural. There's even discussions about movies, because I'm also a culture critic. And so I oftentimes put novels and movies in my nonfiction as a way to explain the way the broader culture understands some of these issues. And so I've been writing fiction and nonfiction for years. The one thing I would say is my parents were Holocaust survivors, both in camps. They never spoke about it, and they died when I was very, very young. So I didn't know very much, and I suspect part of my reason for writing what I call post-Holocaust fiction and writing many of the nonfiction titles and essays that I write are related to seeking answers because I didn't really know much about my family. And I sort of responded to that absence of my childhood knowledge by filling gaps, by committing myself to Holocaust memory, to issues around anti-Semitism, and what I would call moral justice, truth and moral justice, the obligations, the moral imperatives of truth. And so my weekly essays for the Jewish Journal, which you can find on the Jewish Journal or at thanerosenbaum.com, it's a weekly essay. And the subtitle of it is called What Others Won't Say. And a woman wrote me the other day and she said, you're right. That's exactly what your series should be called, What Others Won't Say, because I do tend to weekly say the very thing that might be on someone's mind, but won't say it. So that pretty much covers it.
Well, I can say it sounds like you're describing yourself as politically incorrect. And I would say a dose of truth is always welcome. And particularly as a retired professor myself, I would just say I'm grateful that you write books that are accessible to the general audience, because we all know the reward structure in academia is a little bit different, and it's filled with jargon and obfuscation and generalizations in some cases. So I thank you for all of that.
I appreciate that, but I think one thing I did not mention, what I think is appropriate, is I was a law professor at Fordham Law School for 23 years and then at NYU for 6. But during the period of time that I was writing, especially since I started calling attention to anti-Semitism in Paris, which is around 2007, so I've been lecturing around the world and talking about it. And now we're seeing the last several years how deeply ingrained it's become in American culture and society. It was very difficult for me at those universities to be a law professor who defended Israel or called attention to Holocaust memory or anti-Semitism. And the president of Touro University, which is the largest university under Jewish auspices, I think, in the world, called me up when I was at NYU and he said, "You must be miserable because telling the truth at NYU is probably makes you an endangered species." And I said, "Yes, I am miserable, in fact." And he said, "Look, you come here and we'll protect you." He said, "You may have problems with students and you may have problems with other faculty who all believe that Jews are evil and Israel is worse than that, but we will protect you from that." And I always credit Touro for giving me a home. And if you've been reading me the last few books and the last hundreds of essays, they could not have been written at NYU. Simply not. They would have not, something would have happened. I would have been fired. As it was, I was getting petitions to have me fired even before that. So yes, you're right about it's more than just the jargon. It's also the idea of speaking to a general population as a professor in a way that professors are not allowed to speak. Because I always jokingly say at the faculty lounge, if you're Jewish, if you don't walk in and scream, "Jews are the worst people on the planet, and Israel is the worst human rights violator in the history of the world, worse than the Huns, worse than the Nazis," you don't get fruit cup. If you want fruit cup, you have to start off by saying that. And so that is the reality. And that's the reason I think one is there's an enormous lack of moral courage on campus. So faculty members don't speak out who are Jews. Secondly, to their credit, they don't have tenure and they know their careers will be finished if they said anything like I said. And so they keep their head down, or they say Jews are the worst people in the history of the planet and they get tenure.
Having been a department chair and actually union president, I totally understand where you're coming from. And you're describing, from what I would describe, a very sad truth at many, many, many institutions. So I'm just curious, were you aware, or when did you become aware that you are the child of Holocaust survivors?
I somehow knew as a young boy. I don't remember my parents ever telling me, but I somehow always knew. But I also knew that this was very loaded material, easily ignitable. It was very clear that my parents didn't want me to know. And they did a lot of things, like, for instance, they didn't associate with survivors. They never spoke at all about their past. So, there was an enormous mystery about them. I didn't really know my parents, actually. Things that I learned about them, I learned after I died. I was a young man, and I started learning more from people that knew them. So I just knew, but that was not that uncommon in that era. Not really. This was before Schindler's List, before the Fortunoff Archives Project, before the Spielberg Yom HaShoah Shoah Foundation projects. This is before survivors talked. In fact, I tell people all the time, people forget the word Holocaust survivor didn't even exist until the late 80s, early 90s. So until I was a young man, the word Holocaust itself didn't mean very much. My parents were called European refugees. That was what they were called. In the 1960s, no one would have said, oh, they're Holocaust survivors. No one would have known what that meant. People take for granted that they did, but the vast majority of survivors, another thing, vast majority of survivors were teenagers. We think of them as elderly people, but that's not true. The vast majority were kids who were orphaned, who were kicked back into the world as orphans. And they figured they had to, and no one wanted to hear what they had to say. And they wanted to try to build a life for themselves. So they kept their mouth shut, and they enrolled their children in schools and Little League games and took them out for Dairy Queen ice cream and functioned as, regular American adults. Some of them were more vocal than others. Some of them associated more with survivors, but my parents did not. They deliberately kept me insulated from it. And I will say, since they've been dead from the vast majority of my life, since I was a young man, I think they would be shocked by my career, utterly shocked. They would, and I don't even know if they would approve of it. I think they'd say, wait a minute, you were a Wall Street lawyer and then you left to do this? Why would you do this? So anyway, human beings are built, are imperfectly made.
I just want to say that you anticipated my next question, so I thank you for that. And my parents were also survivors. My mother survived Auschwitz, and my father hid out in the underground and so on. And growing up in the 1950s, I can tell you that nobody wanted to hear about Holocaust. They kept saying, put it away and become an American and move on with your life and so on. So I totally relate to what you're saying, and it shows you how life has a funny way of, making its own circle. So let's move on. That is true. That is true. So now here we are. So we're going to get to your books momentarily, but I want to just ask you a general question. When you started writing your books, you answered that. Did you start as a fiction or nonfiction writer? But more importantly, which is easier for you to write?
Well, I started as a fiction writer, but there again, I did not know I was going to write Holocaust-related, what I call post-Holocaust fiction. My novels are not set during the time period of the Holocaust. They're set either before or after. I hold to the basic rule that Theodor Adorno set out, which is no poetry after Auschwitz, which means don't make art out of the unimaginable. So I've held true. I would never fictionalize the years 1938 to 1945.
Thane, this is Bernie Firstman. Just a quick note here. I'm just going to add to what you're saying. I'm not going to ask you a question. I just want to thank you so much for joining us. Both my parents were survivors. My father, the only survivor in a family of 8 people. And what's ironic today with the spike of anti-Semitism, I've never seen so many movies about the Holocaust come out to meet this challenge. And so it's nice to see, but I find myself very frustrated dealing with people around me who are intelligent, who have moral clarity. They know what's right and wrong. They know what's good and evil. And yet they use the term genocide when it comes to Israeli defense. And this I do not understand, because just go back to the books. Just find out what is the definition of genocide, that it's the willful intent to kill and maim and destroy. And this is not the intention of the Israeli government. But there are other genocides that are happening today as we speak in the Sudan, in China, in Syria, in in Afghanistan, but yet. Right, and no, but I don't see any marches. I don't see any flags. This is the most frustrating thing to me, that I'm speaking to people who are intelligent, and yet they drank the Kool-Aid, and it feels like it's a no-win battle sometimes.
Well, you're anticipating where I expected this to go. So please, Thane, go ahead to respond.
I started writing fiction first. And I did not know that I was going to be writing Holocaust-related fiction. I just knew I had an artistic temperament, and I knew I wanted to say things, but I didn't know what I wanted to say or in the way in which I would say them. So I was very surprised by my first book, Elijah Visible, how it turned out, which was a nine scenarios of one childless survivor in his adult life. And two of the 9 are from his childhood. And so there I was writing about growing up as a child of survivors, and not, and fictionalizing my own experience since I didn't know anything. And so I've written a number of what I would call post-Holocaust novels that have Holocaust themes, all of which are very, very different and speak to different issues. But I found nonfiction to be much harder. And maybe it's because the novels seem to write themselves in a way. I know that sounds strange, but I'm not someone I'm not a disbeliever in ghosts, put it this way. I like the third novel, The Golems of Gotham, I barely remember writing it. It showed up that way. So I wrote it, and it just showed up that way. And I haven't, I know that sounds, very mystical. I'm not a very spiritual or mystical person, but I think I believe in ghosts because the novels are much easier, even though they speak to a much harsher, coarsened, atrocious experience as backdrop, but I find them easier to do.
It's interesting that you said you don't remember writing it, how blessed, but in many ways it's the inner you coming out, saying what you really feel and want to say. So I just want to say that it's often said that children of Holocaust survivors go into the, quote, helping professions. And you, as a writer, commentator, film producer, in the broadest term of an educator, we often say that the solution to people's ignorance about the Holocaust, about Jews, is education. Yet when we look at today's elite colleges and universities, they're in the forefront of behaving atrociously and being vilely anti-Semitic, in my humble opinion. So what, if anything, do you think we should be doing that we're not doing?
I know this is a very depressing thought. I hope it doesn't depress your audience. I don't think education helps. I think that a good example is what Bernie said before. Actually, the heyday of Holocaust-related art and education was the 1990s. That was the era of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., where it was a tougher ticket to get than it was to go to Disney World in D.C. You needed a 6-month waiting period to get to the Holocaust Museum. Schindler's List was the most decorated film of the decade. It became mandatory viewing in schools. Elementary schools in most states had obligatory Holocaust sections, 2-3 weeks in which they were studying. Suddenly, Anne Frank was not the only person they knew that was Holocaust related. The Oscars in the 1990s gave out 6 Best Documentary Awards to Holocaust films. So when Bernie says today, I would say today there's almost he's right, there are some, but I would say there's a dearth of Holocaust-related material compared to the 1990s. So if there was supposed to be an inoculant, an injection against future anti-Semitism, the 1990s would have put it to rest. If you were alive in the 1990s, there were Yom HaShoah programs, not only in every synagogue in America, but I was busy throughout the entire month of Yom HaShoah, traveling to Christian universities, to community colleges where there were no Jews. I was everywhere. I was in place. I was literally everywhere, Everywhere wanted to have some memorial of some kind. Everywhere. And so you would say, well, God, after the 1990s, how could people now say they don't know what the Holocaust was or what happened or what took place? How could they talk about Jews as white privileged and oppressors? How could anyone say that? If you were alive in the 1990s, it would be ludicrous to say that, because you would know that Jews were not only, it's anti-Semitism, not only the world's oldest prejudice, it's the world's favorite prejudice. And yet here we are today. So I don't know. I think that there is a sickness within the human species, and it has something to do with Jews, because Jewish hatred is easily revivable. It can go dormant for 10, 15 years, but it comes back very fast and furious, and with even greater ambitions to surpass its last onset. And so I look at this and say, if anyone thinks that the famous phrase from George Santayana, those who fail to learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat it. This is a great quote, but it's utter nonsense. It's an utter nonsense quote. There's no evidence of that. Even in regular life, there's no evidence. Women get divorced and they'll say, I will never marry a man like that again. And the next person is exactly like that person that they said they weren't going to marry again. So I think that, no, we do, as a species, we do not learn the lessons of history. And as a species, if you give us an excuse, the majority of the world, especially in the West and in the Islamist world, if you give them any excuse to hate Jews, they will grab it.
Sadly, I find myself agreeing with some parts of what you're saying, that not everybody learns. I think some people do. And I will say that. I know this Holocaust Museum reaches many, many people. And my mother used to be a docent here. And there were people who came up to her and said, you changed my life.
Yeah, but they said it then. And so I'm not saying that the museum is not absolutely necessary. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have, I'm saying you should have more museums, but I think that you shouldn't have them as an inoculant, because the evidence is not great. Because if the people that spoke to your parents, I'd give them a call now and say, how are you feeling now about Israel? If they feel now, they're saying, genocidal country, what are you kidding? And then you say, but you told my mother that you benefited so much from this museum. You'd go, there's the paradox. They benefit from it, but if you give them a choice, the option to hate Jews, they will grab it like a brass ring.
I hear you. I would just say this particular young lady was of Catholic Hispanic heritage, and she actually chose to enter into study. She went back to school to become She is, right, to become involved with the Holocaust and teach it. So, that's what we hold out for. I think as Jews, everything is cyclical and you never give up hope. That's what I learned. But okay, so now here we are, and it seems like we are the last acceptable scapegoat and group that it's okay to discriminate against. So how do you think Jewish students should respond?
Well, first of all, there's a few things. Jewish students, are prepared to take the SAT and the MCATs and the LSATs, but they're largely ignorant of Jewish history. They don't know what to say. Some of them are deliberately ignorant and stupid, like the moronic comedian Seth Rogen, who said on a podcast that he was lied to in Hebrew school. And they said, what do you mean? He said, I was told in Hebrew school that there were no Arabs that lived in the Middle East. And I said, no, you weren't. You're an idiot. You were smoking pot instead of attending class. You're just an imbecile. And we should recognize Jews that deliberately go out of their way to either say ignorant things or to say things that they think will make them popular. But I do not believe he went to some school in Vancouver. I simply do not believe that he had a Hebrew school teacher. I mean, I believe he's an imbecile, but I don't believe that his Hebrew school teacher told him that there were no Arabs, but only Jews in Middle East. I don't believe it. So part of the problem is that we have Jewish kids that know how to get the LSAT down, but they really don't know what to say. They don't know how Israel was created. They don't know some really very self-condemning truths about Arabs in the Middle East that they just don't know. They don't know. So not knowing hasn't helped. That's number one. There's some basic knowledge that every Jewish kid should have before they go to college. And if Jewish parents are not, many Jewish parents are equally ignorant. So it's time for the parents and the children to take a half-hour tutorial from a Thane Rosenbaum and get it together, and don't leave for campus until you have that. That's number one. Because nothing's worse than being a Jewish kid screamed at about genocide and shrugging their shoulders and say, I don't know. I really don't know. I had a bar mitzvah, but I don't know what the hell you're talking about. I planted a tree in Israel, but I really don't know what you're talking about. You must be right. Jews steal land. It must be true. Jews kill Arabs deliberately. It must be true. So it must be true because I don't know what to say. I had a bar mitzvah and I don't know what to say. So Jews are clearly not prepared to respond, number one. Number two, Jews, I've said this before, I'm not, I'm not a deliverer of good news. Jews are not that smart. I mean, we can get into medical school, but as a people, we're not really that smart.
Oh, well, we could have a disagreement on that.
No, we're really not. And I'll tell you why. Because their self-esteem is very low as a people. Because there is, in my view, and I've been in universities and traveled around, I have no hesitation saying this. They are determined to sit at the cool kids' table. And they will say anything and agree to anything to sit at the cool kids' table. And this is a very, pathological problem. The students on campus that have fought back in the last 2 years on campus have been alone. At NYU, it must be 30% of the school's Jewish. I was alone. There were very few students that were willing to speak.
I hear you.
Maybe they're right. Maybe they're right. Maybe they're saying, you know what, 4 years goes back fast. I don't want to be miserable 4 years. Who wants Thane Rosenbaum's life? Well, I want that. Who would want to live his life? I want to be invited to parties. I want to get tapped into a fraternity. I want to take a class on the Middle East, but I know that in order to get an A, I have to say Israel's the greatest human rights violation in the world. And I don't give a shit. I'll just say it. It doesn't matter. It's just to get an A to get into law school.
I want to thank the audience for joining us for this episode of Antisemitism and the United Nations and in Society on hmTV. I appreciate my guest, Thane Rosenbaum, for his insights, for sharing his views on global anti-Semitism, terrorism, human rights, moral justice, and war. And we look forward to his continued commentary and writing on important issues that concern us, should concern us, and impact our lives. Be sure to subscribe, share, and stay connected for more engaging conversations. Until next time, make it our time. Take care and be well.